In the mosquito-thick dark of a South Carolina plantation, a man in chains took his seat at the white family's table every single night for 11 years. No one whipped him. No one stopped him. And the silence that followed was louder than any scream. Now, let us begin. The Lowcountry does not forget. It remembers in the way the tide pulls at the marsh grass until the roots bleed salt. It remembers in the slow creak of live oak limbs heavy with Spanish moss, limbs that look like the arms of hanged men swaying in the night wind. And in 1847, along a stretch of land that would later vanish from every official map, the Lowcountry remembered a sin so quiet, so calculated, and so perfectly ordinary that it still haunts the soil beneath what used to be Grayfield Plantation. Picture it. Dusk, late October. The air is thick enough to chew salt, mud, ripe cotton, and the faint iron tang of blood from the fields where the last of the Sea Island crop had been torn from the stalks by calloused hands. Lanterns swing from the big house porch like judgment lamps. Inside the dining room, candlelight falls across polished mahogany, silver that once belonged to a Virginia governor, and bone china plates so thin you could almost see the shame through them. At the head of the table sits Harlan Voss, 43 years old, second-generation planter, master of 900 acres and more than 100 souls. His face is the color of wet clay after rain and strong, sun-baked, but already beginning to crack at the edges. Beside him, Margaret Voss, 38, rice planter's daughter, hands folded so tightly the knuckles glow white. Their children, Thomas, 17, already learning the weight of future ownership, Clara, 14, eyes fixed on her plate as if the pattern of roses there might save her, and little William, 9, kicking his feet under the table, innocent of everything except the smell of roasted quail. The sideboard is heavy with food. The servants move like ghosts, silent, practiced, invisible. Then the door opens. And Kato walks in. He is 27, maybe 28. Tall enough that the low beams of the ceiling seem to bow in deference. Shoulders carved by years of field labor yet somehow graceful. Hands, those. Enormous, precise hands scrubbed clean to the wrists, nails trimmed with a knife he keeps in his boot. He wears the cleanest shirt he owns, the one with the careful patch at the elbow. No shoes, the house rule for black feet has never been spoken tonight, but it hangs in the air anyway. He does not shuffle. He does not drop his gaze to the floorboards. He walks to the empty chair at the far end of the table, the one no one has ever sat in except visiting preachers or the occasional cousin from Charleston, and he sits. The silverware stops moving. For one heartbeat the entire room holds its breath. Even the candles seem to flicker lower, as if ashamed. Harlan Voss looks at him. A long, measuring look. Then, without a word, he nods once slow, almost relieved, and picks up his fork. And so it begins. Not with thunder. Not with rebellion. With the quiet scrape of a chair and the clink of a crystal glass being filled for a man who, by every law written and unwritten in 1847 South Carolina, should have been eating scraps in the kitchen or sleeping in the dirt-floored cabin behind the cotton house. This was not kindness. Kindness would have been easier to explain. Easier to forgive. Easier to bury. This was something colder. Something older. Something that tasted of divine arithmetic. Because Kato had not been invited that first night. Not really. Harlan Voss had simply said, in the expansive glow of the best cotton harvest in 5 years, tell the driver to come eat. A casual command, the kind a man gives when he is drunk on profit and wants to feel generous before God and man. But on the second night, no one sent for Kato. He simply appeared at the same hour, same clothes, same measured steps. And when he sat, Harlan Voss looked up, met his eyes across the candle flames, and nodded again. As if an agreement no one else had heard had already been sealed in some ledger kept by angels or devils. Night after night it continued. Through the long autumn, into the chill of Lowcountry winter when the marshes froze at the edges and the owls called like lost souls. Kato ate from the same plates. Drank from the same glasses. Was served by the same enslaved hands that served the Voss family, hands that trembled slightly as they poured the wine, eyes that never quite met his. And not one word was spoken against it inside the house. Not by the cook, old Mam Ruth, who had buried 3 children sold down river and still sang hymns while she kneaded bread. Not by the housemaid, who polished the silver until her fingers bled and whispered prayers under her breath. not even by Thomas Voss, who watched Kato the way a man watches a loaded pistol left on the supper table. The silence was absolute. Holy, almost. The kind of silence that falls over a church right before the sermon on hell. Outside Grayfield, the Lowcountry talked. Of course it did. News traveled along the tidal creeks faster than the mail packet from Charleston. Neighboring planters heard. The Methodist circuit rider who came once a month heard. Even Sheriff Aldous Pruitt, who owed Harlan Voss money on a bad cotton futures bet, heard. No one rode over. No one sent a letter. No one mentioned it in the county courthouse or the vestry meeting or the Saturday market in Beaufort. Because to speak it aloud would have been to admit that the entire architecture of their world, every law, every whip, every verse from the Bible twisted to justify chains, could be bent by one man who simply refused to stay in his place. And that was unbearable. So they looked away. The way men have always looked away when they sensed the hand of something larger than themselves moving behind the curtain. But what did Kato know? That was the question no one asked out loud, yet it floated above every supper table in St. Helena Parish like smoke from a hidden fire. To understand the weight of what Kato knew, you must understand the soil he had grown in. He had come to Grayfield in the spring of 1832 as a boy of 12 or 13, purchased at a Charleston auction from the liquidated estate of a dead planter up in Colleton District. The bill of sale called him Kato, likely Congo stock, sound of limb, quick to learn. No mother listed. No father. Just a boy with eyes that already watched too much. He arrived the same month Harlan's father, Edmund Voss, was still alive, harder, meaner, the kind of man who quoted scripture while he ordered lashes. Kato watched that man for 3 years. Watched how power moved through the plantation the way sap moves through a live oak, slow, invisible, unstoppable. He watched the ledgers. He watched the factors from Charleston arrive in their fine coats and leave with signed notes that bound Grayfield tighter than any iron chain. He watched Harlan inherit the machine in 1835 and begin oiling it with his own particular brand of quiet ruthlessness. Kato learned the way other men breathe, constantly, without thinking, without permission. He learned the exact day each field needed to be flooded and when the water had to be drawn off so the cotton roots would not rot. He learned which hands could pick 300 pounds a day and which would break at 200. He learned the weather signs the old Gullah women taught in secret songs sung while they chopped weeds. And late at night, in the flickering light of a stolen candle stub, he taught himself to read by tracing the columns in the overseer's careless ledger books, sounding out the words the same way a man learns to read the Bible when he is starving for God. He learned the shape of Harlan Voss's debts. Because the entire Lowcountry ran on credit the way a dying man runs on prayer. Every bale of Sea Island cotton was already promised to factors in Charleston before it even opened in the field. Every acre was mortgaged. Every enslaved body was collateral. Harlan Voss had expanded Grayfield by buying failing neighbors' land at auction prices, but those purchases had been financed by notes that could be called in at any moment. One bad harvest, one panic in Liverpool, and the whole elegant house of cards would collapse. Kato knew the numbers better than Harlan himself. He knew because he had stood in the cotton house at night, long after the white overseer Denton Frick had gone to bed drunk, and copied the figures into the dust with a stick, memorizing them the way a preacher memorizes Revelation. He knew which fields were exhausted. He knew which slaves were too sick to work but still listed as able so the books would look healthy. He knew about the hidden account in Charleston that Harlan used to pay for the pretty quadroon mistress he kept in a rented house on Trad Street, payments that, if discovered by Margaret Voss, would have shattered the careful fiction of their Christian marriage. Kato knew. And somehow, without ever speaking a threat, without ever raising his voice, Harlan Voss had come to understand that he knew. That was the true bargain struck at that supper table. Not friendship. Not mercy. A transaction older than cotton, older than slavery itself. The master fed the one man who could destroy him, because the alternative was to starve in the sight of God. And every night, as the candles burned lower and the marsh winds moaned outside the windows, the Voss family ate in the presence of their own judgment. Kato never smiled. Never gloated. He simply sat there, still, attentive, enormous hands resting beside the silver, answering questions about soil pH and ginning times with the quiet precision of a man who had already read the final page of the story. And in the silence between the clink of forks and the crackle of the fire, something ancient stirred. Because the Lowcountry has always believed in balance. The Gullah elders spoke of it in stories carried from Africa in the bellies of slave ships, stories of ancestors who watched from the other side of the water, keeping accounts no white man could erase. The white preachers thundered about divine justice from their pulpits, never realizing their own words might one day be turned against them. Harlan Voss felt it in his bones. Some nights, after Kato had left and the family retired, Harlan would stand alone at the window overlooking the quarters, watching the single lantern burning in Kato's cabin. And he would whisper the same question the household servants dared not ask aloud. What does he want? But the real question, the one that kept him awake until the first gray light touched the marsh, was far more terrifying. What does God want? Because in the end, every man who builds his house on the backs of the broken must one day sit down to supper with the bill. And on Grayfield Plantation in the autumn of 1847, the bill had finally arrived, wearing clean clothes and the face of a man who had learned to read the handwriting on the wall before anyone else even knew the feast had begun. The table was set. The guest had come. And the meal would last 11 years. Now, let us return to the Lowcountry winter of 1847. The air had turned sharp. January winds swept off the marsh like the breath of something ancient and unforgiving, carrying the scent of salt, decay, and the faint, metallic promise of coming judgment. At Grayfield Plantation, the big house stood against the cold like a whitewashed tomb, its columns gleaming under frost, its windows glowing with oil lamps that cast long, trembling shadows across the yard. Inside the dining room, the ritual continued with the grim precision of a sacrament no one dared refuse. Kato entered each evening at the exact same hour. His footsteps on the wide plank floors were soft but deliberate, the sound of a man who had measured every inch of his prison and found its weaknesses. He sat in the same chair, back straight, those large, capable hands resting beside the silver as if they belonged there. The Voss family had begun to move around him like figures in a painting, careful not to disturb the composition. Margaret Voss spoke only to her husband or her children, her voice a thin veil of normalcy stretched over dread. Thomas watched Kato with the hungry eyes of a boy who sensed power shifting beneath his feet but could not name it. Little William still chattered innocently about ponies and riverboats, unaware that the tall black man sharing his supper held the keys to his father's entire world. The household staff served Kato with the same practiced invisibility they offered the family. Yet their hands trembled when they refilled his glass. Old Ma'am Ruth, the cook, muttered psalms under her breath as she carved the meat, prayers for protection, for deliverance, for the day when the scales would finally balance. And still, no one spoke of it. Not Denton Frick, the overseer, whose tongue was usually as loose as his bookkeeping. Frick had strong opinions about the natural order, about the proper place of every soul on God's green earth. Yet he looked at Kato seated at the master's table and chose silence. A calculated silence. The kind that comes when a man realizes he is standing too close to a loaded cannon. Among the enslaved community, the feelings ran deeper, more tangled, like the roots of the live oaks that twisted beneath the soil. There was awe, yes, the raw, dangerous awe of watching one of their own rewrite the rules without raising a hand. Kato, the head driver, had always stood between them and the whip. But now his authority felt different. It felt personal. Selfish, even. In the quarters at night, around low fires, whispers passed like contraband. One woman in particular carried the heaviest weight of those whispers. Her name was Nora. She had been at Grayfield longer than most, arriving with Edmund Voss when the plantation was little more than raw marsh and ambition. At 45, she was small but unbreakable, her movements in the kitchen as deliberate as a chess master's. She had seen children born, sold, and buried. She had buried 2 husbands. She had learned to read the hearts of both white masters and black souls with equal clarity. One bitter January evening, after the supper dishes had been cleared and the big house had settled into its uneasy quiet, Nora found Kato alone. He was crossing the frost-hardened yard toward the cotton house, lantern light flickering across his tall frame. Nora stood at the well, drawing water for the morning's work, her breath rising in white clouds. She did not waste words. "You know what you're doing?" Her voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of generations who had learned that every question could be a trap. Kato stopped. The cold bit deep. I know what I'm doing. Nora's eyes narrowed. And when it's done? When whatever ghost you're chasing finally lies still, what happens to the rest of us? He was quiet for a long moment. The marsh wind moaned through the oaks, sounding almost like distant voices crying for justice. Nothing changes for the rest of you, he said at last. That's not what this is. Nora studied him, her gaze sharp enough to cut through lies. You sure about that? No, Kato admitted, his voice barely above the wind. But it's what I intend. She turned back to the well without another word. The bucket creaked on its rope. Kato continued to the cotton house. Neither of them ever spoke of it again. But Nora's question lingered in the cold air like smoke from a hidden fire. What did Kato intend? It was not simple freedom. Freedom in the Lowcountry in 1848 was a gamble with terrible odds, marshes that swallowed men whole, roads patrolled by patrollers with dogs and guns, and the constant shadow of the auction block waiting for those who failed. Kato had considered escape the way a chess player considers a sacrifice, possible, but rarely wise. No. What Kato wanted was more precise. More dangerous. He intended to survive Grayfield, not by running from it, but by becoming its spine. He would make himself so essential, so deeply woven into the machinery of the plantation and the hidden ledger of Harlan Voss's sins, that the system itself would have no choice but to protect him. Enslaved in name, untouchable in practice. It was an audacious vision. Almost impossible. And it was working. The dinner table was not the beginning. It was merely the visible scar. For nearly a decade, Kato had been doing the quiet, grinding work that kept Grayfield alive. He caught errors in the Charleston factors' accounts that would have bled Harlan Voss dry. He timed the harvests with an almost prophetic precision, reading the wind, the rain, and the soil the way others read scripture. He managed the labor force with a firm but measured hand, preventing the kind of despair and sickness that could ruin an entire season. He did it all without fanfare. Without ever stepping out of the role assigned to him. But Harlan Voss noticed. And in the golden afterglow of the 1847 harvest, the best in years, Voss made his own cold calculation. Kato at the table cost him social discomfort. Kato in the fields, quietly steering the plantation toward profit and shielding his secrets, was worth far more. So the table became part of the bargain. A silent transaction sealed with candlelight and silver. But the true power, the leverage that made neighbors, ministers, and even the sheriff look away, came from something far darker. It came from a night in the spring of 1846. Reginald Havestock had arrived at Grayfield then under the pretense of a social visit. Havestock was a planter from Colleton District, roughly Harlan's age, connected through the tangled web of Lowcountry families and shared sins. There had always been a coolness between them, an old rivalry, a shadow of distrust that neither man named. The visit lasted 3 days. On the second night, after the household had retired and the whiskey had flowed freely, something happened in the study of the big house. Kato had been awake, as he often was, working late in the nearby cotton house by the dim light of a lantern. The night was warm, still, the kind where sound carried clearly across the yard through open windows. He heard everything. Havestock, his voice thick with rage and drink, had unleashed words that could destroy men. He spoke of a transaction several years earlier, a sale of an enslaved person from his own holdings to a buyer in New Orleans. On paper, it had been recorded as a simple, legal sale. But the truth Havestock spat out in his fury was far uglier. It involved deception, coercion, possibly murder. Details that implicated not only Havestock but at least 2 other prominent men in the county, including, in ways that were never fully spoken but clearly implied, connections that reached Harlan Voss himself. Kato had stood motionless in the cotton house, the lantern flame trembling in his hand, as the full weight of the confession drifted through the open study window on the marsh breeze. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply listened with the same patient precision he brought to every ledger and every field. Then he filed the knowledge away, like a weapon cleaned and oiled, waiting for the day it would be needed. That day had come by the autumn of 1847. Harlan Voss understood, in the marrow of his bones, that Kato carried a secret capable of burning his world to ash. One whispered word to the wrong ear, perhaps even to the right ear, and the fragile house of credit, reputation, and carefully buried sins that held Greyfield together would collapse. The dinner table was the price of Kato's silence. A daily reminder that the master now dined with his own judgment. And the community looked away because many of them carried similar shadows. The Lowcountry planter class was bound together not just by blood and cotton, but by 1,000 small and large crimes against humanity, crimes they had justified with twisted scripture and economic necessity. To expose Kato's presence at the table would risk opening the floodgates to questions no one wanted answered. What else was hidden? Whose hands were truly clean? So they chose the comfort of willful blindness. The same blindness that had allowed slavery itself to flourish under the guise of divine order. But God, the old preachers liked to say, is not mocked. And in the quiet evenings at Greyfield, as Kato sat at the table with steady eyes and measured speech, something sacred and terrifying was unfolding. A reckoning dressed in the clothes of civility. A slow divine justice that moved not with thunder and lightning, but with the patient scrape of a chair, the clink of crystal, and the unblinking gaze of a man who had learned to read both the soil and the human soul with equal clarity. Harlan Voss ate his supper each night in the company of his greatest threat. And every bite tasted of ash and impending judgment. Because Kato knew. Not just the numbers in the ledgers. Not just the shape of the debts. But the shape of the sin itself. And he was willing to wait. 11 years worth of waiting, if that was what it took. The marsh watched. The live oaks listened. And the table remained set. The winter of 1848 clung to the Lowcountry like a fever that refused to break. Damp cold seeped through the walls of the big house, turning every fireplace into a desperate altar of smoke and snapping pine. The smell of burning oak mixed with marsh rot created an atmosphere thick enough to taste suffocating, heavy with unspoken guilt. Outside, the live oaks dripped with condensation, their Spanish moss swaying like funeral veils in the wind. Inside, the Voss family moved through their days carrying a new, invisible weight. Kato's presence at the supper table had hardened from novelty into ritual. A daily communion no one blessed. Thomas Voss, now 18, could no longer stomach it. The young heir, raised to believe the world bent naturally to white wool and divine order, watched his father share bread in conversation with an enslaved man as if the laws of God and man had quietly dissolved. One evening in January he confronted Harlan Voss in the study. "It's a business arrangement," his father said flatly, eyes on the ledger. "I understand enough," Thomas replied, voice cracking with the rage of betrayed inheritance. Harlan looked at his son with something close to pity. "No," he said softly. "You don't." Thomas never asked again. Instead he fled to the taverns in Beaufort, drinking just enough to blur the image of Kato seated at the family table like a silent judge. Clara Voss, 15 now, responded differently. She watched everything with the fierce, analytical hunger of a mind too sharp for her cage. At supper she catalogued Kato's every gesture, the way his large hands rested calmly beside the silver, the precise way he answered questions about soil and yields, the stillness in his face that made the candles seem to burn lower. In her journal, hidden beneath her mattress and written in a hand growing ever more precise, she recorded her growing dread. "He watches everything. I do not think Father understands how much he watches. He knows more about this plantation than Father does. He knows more about everything here than any of us. And I am certain he intends something." She was right. What Kato intended had been forged in patience sharper than any blade. Since the spring of 1846, when Reginald Havestock's drunken threats had drifted through the open study window into the cotton house, Kato had become a ghost in the records. He moved through ledgers like a shadow. He read correspondence left momentarily unattended. He studied documents from the locked box in the study during rare moments when Harlan Voss stepped away. With the same methodical care he brought to timing the cotton harvest, Kato reconstructed the full map of Edmund Voss's sins. He learned how the old man, Harlan's father, had falsified ownership papers on several enslaved people to conceal a crushing debt owed to a Virginia creditor. The transactions violated South Carolina law in ways that could unravel Greyfield's title, cull in every loan, and leave the Voss family ruined. Reginald Havestock possessed a copy of his own father's written account of the fraud. He had planned to use it as a weapon to force Harlan to surrender the strategic 200-acre parcel and its title creek. But Kato knew more. Years earlier, while sweeping the cotton house floor as a boy, he had discovered Edmund Voss's true hiding place, a loose board beneath a heavy seed bin, overlooked by everyone else. Inside lay the original falsified documents, brittle with age but damning in their clarity. Kato had never touched them. He had simply memorized their location and waited, the way a hunter waits for the perfect shot. By autumn 1847, his knowledge was complete. One evening after supper, in the quiet of the study, Kato approached Harlan Voss. He carried no threats, only facts laid out with the calm precision of a man reading from the Book of Judgment. He detailed the exact nature of Edmund Voss's fraud. He explained how exposure would trigger cascading financial ruin. Then he made his proposal, simple and merciless. In exchange for certain arrangements, including a permanent seat at the family dinner table, Kato would help neutralize the threat from Reginald Havestock. He would provide the originals. He would guide the strategy. He would do it not out of loyalty, but because it served his own long game. Harlan Voss listened in silence. Then he did something that even Kato had not anticipated. He laughed, a short, bitter bark that echoed like a cough in the dim room. "You've been planning this for a long time." "Yes, sir." "How long?" Kato considered the question with the same stillness he showed at supper. "Since I was about 15. Harlan Voss stared at him for a long moment, the weight of years and sins pressing down. Finally he spoke two words that sealed the bargain. "All right." And so the arrangement deepened. The dinner table became more than a symbol. It became the visible proof of the new, terrible equilibrium at Grayfield. Kato now spoke more freely during meals, offering insights on fields, labor, and markets that even Denton Frick could not match. Harlan Voss listened. Sometimes he nodded. The family ate in silence, forks scraping against china like nails on a coffin lid. Then came March 1848. Reginald Havestock arrived unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, riding up the long avenue of live oaks with the arrogance of a man who believed his moment had come. A lawyer from Beaufort, Gideon Taft, rode beside him, clutching a leather satchel and looking distinctly uneasy. Harlan Voss received them in the parlor with unnatural calm. He offered bourbon. He waited. Havestock wasted no time. He declared he would file papers exposing Edmund Voss's fraud. The land dispute would be settled in his favor or Grayfield would burn in court. Consequences would be severe: seizure, debt calls, total ruin. Harlan sipped his drink. Then, with that same quiet pity he had shown his son, he said, "I'd like you to meet someone." He called for Kato. Kato entered not from the yard but from the study where he had clearly been waiting. He carried a leather folder. He sat across from Havestock and Taft with the unhurried composure of a man who had rehearsed this moment for years. What followed lasted 40 agonizing minutes. Kato laid out document after document. Not Havestock's second-hand copy, but the original falsified records Edmund Voss had hidden in the cotton house. He spread them across the table with surgical precision. Lawyer Gideon Taft leaned forward, spectacles glinting, studying each page with growing astonishment. Then Kato revealed something else. A second set of documents detailing a transaction from Havestock's own plantation. The sale of an enslaved person to New Orleans, recorded as voluntary but violating a specific 1820 South Carolina statute still technically in force. The violation was serious enough to invite heavy penalties if brought before the right court. Kato had gathered this evidence the same way he gathered everything, through fragments, overheard whispers, and patient observation over years. He had filed it away like a seed waiting for the right season. Havestock's face cycled through emotions: shock, rage, then something approaching fear. "Where did you get these?" he demanded. Kato met his eyes without flinching. "That's not relevant." Havestock turned to Harlan Voss, voice rising. "You're going to let him speak to me like that?" Harlan stared into his bourbon glass. "He's speaking the truth," he said quietly. "It's not relevant." The silence that followed was suffocating. Outside, the marsh lay in early spring stillness, the kind of quiet that feels like the world holding its breath before judgment. A mockingbird called once from the live oaks, then fell silent. Havestock stood. He picked up his hat. He looked at Kato one final time, really looked at the tall, still man who had just dismantled his threat with documents and calm logic. In that moment, the power in the room had shifted completely. The white planter and his lawyer had come to bully and threaten. They left facing a new reality. An enslaved man held the original sins of both their families in his hands, and he had chosen to wield that power not with violence, but with the quiet precision of divine accounting. As Havestock's horse disappeared down the Oak Avenue, Harlan Voss remained in the parlor, staring at the empty chairs. Kato stood nearby, folder closed, face unreadable. "You think this ends it?" Harlan asked. Kato's answer came soft, almost gentle, carrying the weight of biblical patience. "No, sir. This is only the beginning of the balance." Outside, the marsh winds picked up, whispering through the moss like ancestral voices long denied justice. The live oaks seemed to lean closer, listening. The big house creaked as if settling under a new, heavier burden. Clara Voss, watching secretly from the hallway, later wrote in her journal with a hand that trembled slightly. "Tonight I saw something I cannot name." Father looked smaller. The tall man looked eternal. Like the angel at the gate with the flaming sword. "I am afraid of what comes next. But I cannot look away." She was right to be afraid. Because Kato had not come for revenge alone. He had come for something deeper, something that tasted of Old Testament reckoning wrapped in the patient strategy of survival. He had made himself the keeper of sins. And every night at the master's table, he reminded Harlan Voss that the bill for those sins was still being tallied, one quiet supper at a time. The marsh continued its eternal rhythm, tide in, tide out, washing nothing clean. 11 years of this delicate, terrifying dance had only just begun. And somewhere in the spiritual architecture of the Lowcountry, where guilt and power had long twisted together like vines on a tomb, the scales of justice were slowly, inexorably, beginning to tip. The March afternoon in 1848 ended with the soft crunch of hooves on oystershell gravel. Reginald Havestock and his lawyer Gideon Taft rode away from Grayfield without another word. Havestock's face carried the stunned, hollow expression of a man who had come to collect a debt and instead found his own ledger held open before him. Taft clutched his satchel like a shield. The live oaks watched them go, their heavy limbs draped in moss swaying gently, as if the trees themselves had witnessed too many such reckonings and no longer cared to comment. The legal threat evaporated. No papers were filed. The land dispute died in silence. But the story spread through St. Helena Parish the way secrets always travel in tight-knit worlds built on fragile hierarchies, through half-spoken implications, meaningful glances, and the heavy pauses between sentences. Planters at church picnics, ministers over port, women at sewing circles, all of them sensed it. Something fundamental at Grayfield had shifted. The balance of power had tilted, engineered not by rebellion or violence, but by a man who, according to every law and custom of 1848 South Carolina, was legally nothing more than another man's property. The summer that followed was brutal. Heat rose off the marsh in shimmering waves, thick and merciless. Sea Island cotton thrived in it, the long staple fibers swelling white and luxurious under the relentless sun, but the people at Grayfield wilted. Nights brought no relief, only restless tossing beneath mosquito nets, the distant croak of frogs, and the low, constant hum of something unspoken hanging in the air like smoke from a distant fire. The dinner table ritual continued. Kato still appeared each evening, still sat in the same chair, still answered questions about yields and weather in markets with that same measured precision. But now the atmosphere carried a different weight. A sense of suspended judgment. One sweltering July evening, Thomas Voss returned from the tavern in Beaufort with storm clouds in his eyes. He had heard the distorted version of the parlor confrontation with Havestock, the one where an enslaved driver had produced damning documents and sent a white planter away humbled. Thomas marched straight into his father's study. Their conversation lasted deep into the night. Clara Voss, listening from her adjacent room, caught only fragments through the thin wall. Thomas's voice began loud with outrage, then dropped to a terrifying whisper. She heard him ask, "And what happens when he decides he wants more?" Harlan Voss answered softly. Thomas pressed again. A long silence followed. Then Thomas stormed out, boots heavy on the stairs, and did not return until dawn. That question, what happens when he decides he wants more, had been haunting every corner of Grayfield for months. It lived in Margaret's tight-lipped silences, in Denton Frick's deliberate avoidance, in Nora's watchful eyes as she served the meals. It circled the dinner table like an uninvited guest. But Harlan Voss had already begun answering it in the only way he could. Quietly, without announcement, he had started the long, difficult process of manumission. In 1848 South Carolina, freeing an enslaved person was no simple act. The state legislature had tightened the rules for years, fearing any crack in the system amid rising national tensions. A petition required exceptional justification, legislative approval, and navigated a climate growing ever more hostile to anything that smelled of loosening control. Yet Harlan Voss pursued it anyway. He hired a discreet Charleston lawyer, Cornelius Pringle, known for handling delicate matters without fanfare. The petition was filed in secrecy. Harlan argued that Cato's role had become legally ambiguous in ways that threatened the plantation's stability. The unusual dinner table arrangement, the deep involvement in financial affairs, the practical power he already exercised, all of it created risks better resolved by formal freedom. It was a coldly pragmatic case, stripped of any moral language. The committee approved it with visible reluctance in the spring of 1849. On an April morning in 1849, Kato became a free man. He was 29 years old. He had lived 17 years in bondage. The last decade of those years had been spent with extraordinary patience and nerve, weaving the very threads that would unravel his chains. He did not leave immediately. That was the detail that puzzled everyone who later heard the story. After gaining legal freedom, Kato stayed at Grayfield for another 6 months. He continued managing the fields. He continued appearing at the dinner table each night. The only visible change was a modest wage recorded in the ledgers and kept by Kato in a small tin box in the cotton house. Not generous, but real. Clara noticed the shift in him. In her journal she wrote, "There is a new quality in his attention now. The long waiting that has defined him seems to be drawing toward its end." The petition had succeeded not because anyone believed in justice, but because Harlan Voss had framed manumission as the cleanest way to tidy up a dangerous complication he himself had allowed to grow. Kato knew about the process almost from the start. A letter from Pringle had passed through the cotton house. He read it, as he read everything, and said nothing. He simply continued his work, his nightly presence at the table now carrying the subtle air of a man whose exit strategy was already in motion. Then, in October 1849, he left. No grand announcement. No farewell conversation that anyone recorded. One morning he packed his few belongings into a small bundle, walked down the long avenue of live oaks, and simply did not return. Clara watched from her window. She later wrote, "He did not look back. Not once. I watched until he disappeared from sight, and he never turned. I think he said goodbye to this place many years ago. He was only waiting for his body to follow." The question everyone had feared, what happens when he decides he wants more, never needed answering in the way Thomas had imagined. Kato had never wanted more. He had wanted exactly what he had planned since he was a boy of 15, out. Freedom. The chance to walk away under his own power, on his own terms. Not revenge. Not destruction of the Voss family. Not even the satisfaction of watching Grayfield slowly fail, though it did to struggling under Thomas's weaker hand after Harlan's death in 1857 from heart trouble brought on by years of hidden stress. By 1861 the plantation was faltering. By 1865, with the Civil War's end, the entire Lowcountry economy collapsed, and Grayfield was finished. Margaret Voss lived until 1871. Clara married and moved away, continuing her journal until her own death. That journal, hidden for decades in a traveling trunk, would eventually surface in fragments offering the most intimate, haunting glimpses into those strange years. Denton Frick left in 1850 and never spoke openly of what he had seen, though in a letter to his brother he wrote cryptically, "I have seen things in this work I would not have believed possible. The the strangest was at a place in Beaufort district where a man did something I still cannot entirely account for. I will not write it down, but I think about it. Nora remained until emancipation in 1863, then worked on for wages until her death in 1871. She took her thoughts to the grave in the small cemetery at the edge of the old quarters. The county courthouse fire in 1879, widely suspected but never proven to be more than an accident, destroyed most official records of the manumission, the have-stock dispute, and the financial maneuvers. What remained were fragments, shadows, and the enduring mystery. After leaving Grayfield, traces of a man matching Kato's description appear in Charleston's free black community in the early 1850s. A tall, precise individual handling accounts for waterfront trading houses. Exceptionally skilled with figures. A 1853 letter from lawyer Cornelius Pringle refers to a former client of unusual ability who understood Charleston's financial web better than men born into it. The description fits. The trail then grows cold. Kato had built his freedom the only way the world allowed a man in his position to build it, through knowledge, patience, and the careful stewardship of other men's sins. The dinner table had been the visible price, 11 years of sitting in the seat of judgment, eating from the master's china while reminding Harlan Voss nightly that the ledger of consequences was still open. Was it worth it? The long years of watching, waiting, holding dangerous truths like stones in his chest? The record cannot say. Kato left too few words behind. He was careful even in absence. But Clara's final observation remains the most haunting. He never looked back. In the early morning light of that October day in 1849, as mist rose from the marsh and the live oaks stood like silent witnesses, a man who had spent 17 years forging the conditions of his own deliverance simply walked away. His footsteps faded down the avenue. The big house grew smaller behind him. The weight of Grayfield, the chains, the secrets, the strange ritual at the supper table, slipped from his shoulders like an old coat he no longer needed. He had already said goodbye long ago. The Lowcountry kept its silence. The marsh continued its eternal breathing. The cotton fields, tended by others, eventually gave way to time and war and change. And somewhere, in the fragments that history failed to swallow completely, the story of Kato lingers, not as a tale of dramatic rebellion or easy redemption, but as something far more unsettling. A story of quiet, calculated dignity. Of a man who understood that true power, in a world built on domination, sometimes looks like sitting down at the table, and then, when the moment is right, standing up and walking away without ever turning around. The scales had balanced. The meal was finished. And the guest had finally left the master's table, free. What do you think really happened at Grayfield? Was Kato's freedom the end of the story, or only the beginning of something the records were never meant to preserve? Tell me in the comments. If stories like this, ones that live in the gray space between documented fact and haunting human truth, move you, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who appreciates the kind of history that chills without needing ghosts. We'll meet again soon, in the next hidden corner of the past.